Hello, let me introduce myself. My name is Jonathan Kahn, and I'm a professor of religion, Africana studies, and American studies here at Vassar. I have been teaching at the college now for 16 years. That's remarkable to hear me say out loud. It feels like a long time. But I also say that with a great deal of pleasure and pride. I love teaching here at Vassar College. I think the things we do in the classroom and the work that me and my colleagues do research-wise makes this a remarkable institution and one that I am super proud to call my home. So before I begin today with some observations, or what I'm calling reflections about Amy Cooper and the white disavowal of racism, I'd like to tell you a little bit about myself and about my biography and how I came to study and teach and write about African American religion, and in particular, race, politics, and Christian ethics. So, as you can see, I'm a white guy. I'm also Jewish. So to state the obvious, I am neither black nor Christian. Yet what first drew me to the intersection of Christianity, race, was reading James Baldwin as an undergraduate and wrestling with the complexities of the imperative that he gave us, which is that America is in desperate need of a reckoning with who we are, what we've done, and who we've become. I was fascinated with what I think of as that Baldwin we, which in his hands has transmogrifying powers, referring in one moment to African Americans, and the next to white liberals, and the next to white bigots, and the next to multiracial coalitions of democratic citizens. I took Baldwin's we as an invitation to understand who I am, as a process of interrelation and interdependence and interconnection with who, at first glance, I am not. And so I began to construct my we around the unmistakable way in which that in the hands of American abolitionists, and here I'm talking about slavery abolitionists of the 19th century, and then I'm talking about the tradition of their heirs that runs through W.E.B. Du Bois and Nannie Burroughs and Fannie Lou Hamer and Martin Luther King and John Lewis, to name just a few. That the ways in which Christianity became for them the vital and critical leaven for practicing freedom. Christianity was how they baked their bread. Said slightly differently, if Hannah Nicole Jones of the New York Times' 1619 Project is right in saying that America is founded on an ideal and a lie, and if she's right in saying that America's black citizens, in pursuing democratic ideals, in order to combat the lies, are, quote, the perfecters of this democracy, end quote, then there's no way to understand the historical contours of the American attempt to bring into being a multiracial democracy without a serious encounter with Christianity. More, that encounter cannot be considered serious if it also doesn't reveal the converse, which is that Christianity did not serve simply as a leaven for freedom, but Christianity gave rise to the lies that America tells. So many of the lies, so much of the ideological and material forms of oppression draw from Christian wells. So for me, confronting this story, one made up of endless contradictions and complexities, made me feel more rooted in the world, made me think of my neighbors as those I needed to be in conversation with in order to understand myself. That for me was the implications of Baldwin's we. Now, the case of Amy Cooper doesn't have much to do with Christianity, although if you got me going, I probably could make the connections. But it does have everything to do with the sort of reckoning that Baldwin calls for with who we are and what we've become. And if your spring and summer has been anything like mine, long-term plans, in my case, the book I've been working on, have been set aside in order to address what King called quote, the fierce urgency of now, end quote. For me, that's meant serving on the Vassar Together committee that's been working to plan for fall classes, about which I am incredibly excited. And it's meant reading, thinking about, and trying to write about the protest movement that has emerged most immediately in the light of the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery. And of all the white voices I've heard this spring, Amy Cooper's is the one that continues to haunt me. Now, here are the facts that I'm sure you know. Amy Cooper is the white woman whose response to a black man, Christian Cooper, and his request for her to leash her dog in the birdwatching section of Central Park followed a well-worn American script. She demonized and explicitly threatened him because he was black, and she exercised her threat by calling on and lying to the police to discipline him. That she did this on the very day that George Floyd was killed by the police only throws the stakes of calls like Cooper's into tragic and horrifying relief. Is it too much to suggest that Amy Cooper, in falsely and frantically calling the police to report that a black man was threatening her life, was, in effect, threatening to murder Christian Cooper? The outrage that built against Ms. Cooper was swift and furious, and she's paid a considerable price. A fascinating aspect, by the way, of this whole thing has been Mr. Cooper's unwillingness to participate in the legal prosecution of Miss Cooper for her deeds. And perhaps some other time we can talk about whether the consequences meted out for Ms. Cooper were just. But instead, I want to draw your attention to what I think has been an overlooked aspect of this case: Ms. Cooper's brief explanations after the fact for what she did. In her subsequent public statement, Ms. Cooper was contrite, seemingly sincerely so, and yet she concluded her comments with the following, and these are the comments that for me stood out and have haunted me. She says, quote, "I am not racist. I did not mean to harm that man in any way," end quote. How do we make sense of these utterances? On its face, Ms. Cooper's disavowal of racism would seem absurd. Ms. Cooper explicitly told Mr. Cooper that she was going to call the police and tell them that a, quote, African-American man was threatening her. She was the one who raised the specter of race. And if you listen to the tape carefully, the tone with which she says this seems knowing. She seems to know full well how this single racialized marker, an African-American man, can supercharge the moment. As Gina Belafonte of the New York Times points out, Cooper's use of African-American is not insignificant. Cooper's use of African-American befits a member of the corporate business class who has taken racial bias workshops. And of course, Ms. Cooper was part of that corporate business class working at an investment bank. This would suggest that she knew at least something of the history of anti-black police brutality. And it also suggests that she couldn't resist deploying it in that moment. It seems axiomatic, anyway, that to threaten to call the police on anyone is to mean to harm them in some way. And to threaten to do this to someone based on perceiving them to be African American should be considered as, well, the sage Paul Ryan once said about then candidate Trump's comments about the Indiana-born judge of Mexican heritage presiding over the Trump University fraud case. What Ryan said was, that's the textbook definition of racism. So what could Amy Cooper possibly have meant by saying that she is not racist and did not mean to harm Mr. Cooper in any way? What does the very possibility of these utterances say about the nature of racism in America? The first thing that jumps out to me is Cooper's use of the pronoun I. In other words, let's focus for the moment less now on what Cooper thinks racism is, and more on where Cooper seems to locate it. For Cooper, racism and the harm it does is something that lives within her personally, in her own subjectivity. She tells us this explicitly when she says, "I am not racist. I did not mean to harm him." What Cooper does in order to figure out if she's racist or means harm is turn inward and ask herself a bunch, or at least one would think, a bunch of personal probing questions. She would seem to ask, does racism live within me? And if it does, how would I know it? Well, let me look at my feelings and my intent. Now, let me just say that lots of white people have asked this question of themselves. I'd hazard a bet that most of us have. I know I have. And it can lead to a kaleidoscopic set of images and moments and experiences and details where the white person does a rapid set of calculations about an inventory of feelings and intentions, some pluses here, some minuses there, to come to some conclusion, some total that either says yay or nay on one's own racism. Ms. Cooper, of course, is driven to give herself a clean bill of health. Now, Robin DiAngelo, of recent fame because of her best-selling book, White Fragility, would say that Amy Cooper's inability to see herself as a racist is a classic example of white fragility. That is, the inability of white people to reckon with, confront, and admit the racist feelings and beliefs and intentions that white people hold in their hearts. White tears, which is what DiAngelo identifies as what follows when white people are confronted with their own racism, comes from the discomfort of being forced to acknowledge those feelings. When a white person cries white tears, they are crying because they feel hurt, indicted, and guilty. What I want to point out is that both white fragility and white tears reinforce the notion that racism most critically lives within the inner life of white people. DiAngelo, especially in our moment, has a flourishing business of workshops that push white people to acknowledge their own racist feelings instead of disavowing them. These workshops, or so the accounts of them go, train white people to continue to focus on themselves and the feelings they have in their own breasts, but to have a different affective response than before. Instead of being defensive to the presence of racist feelings, the process of overcoming white fragility requires a different relationship to one's inner life. What remains the same, however, is that racism is most crucially charted and mapped in the inner reaches of the white soul. When Cooper and DiAngelo go looking for racism, they go looking for it in the same place. Now, I do not want to suggest that this work is unimportant. It is important. White people breathe American air, and in taking full and deep breaths, we inhale racism. Racism has a life within white people as individuals. But I also want to suggest, or at least offer this perhaps today as a provocation, that we may be going down the wrong road if the discussion about racism is thought of as a turf war over the nature of the white soul. I want to suggest that we are going down the wrong road if the focus of white people's attention is on themselves and the degrees to which they are racist or not. I'm suspicious of this amount of inward gazing. DiAngelo's work, as well-intentioned and powerful that it is, would seem to perpetuate the idea that the important question is whether an individual white person is willing or able to do an inventory of themselves and confess their racism. In particular, I worry about this because white people may then think that the act of confession constitutes the solution. We can confess our sins and move on. One of the most powerful pieces I read this summer was by Kiana Mariah Ross, a professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University. It was a piece in which she argued that anti-blackness, rather than racism, better describes the forces that killed George Floyd. Racism, Mariah Ross argued, is extremely broad and diffuse and functions, quote, as a catch-all that can encapsulate anything, end quote. Anti-blackness, on the other hand, focuses the mind and analysis on concrete acts and actions that express, quote, disdain, disregard, and disgust for black existence, end quote. Part of what I think Mariah Ross maps in this distinction between racism and anti-Blackness is whose subjectivity is in focus. An emphasis on racism focuses attention on white people and white institutions because in order to figure out if these people or institutions are racist, we need to look at them more closely. An emphasis on anti-Blackness, on the other hand, focuses attention on the experiences of Black people and pushes us to ask whether those experiences, whether or not they come from racist intent, are dehumanizing, oppressive, and represent instances of domination. If white people can see instances of anti-Blackness, see the suffering that comes from the exercise of arbitrary and dominating power, rather than constantly asking recursive questions about their own racism, just perhaps white people and society as a whole might be moved to do something about it. It's possible, I think, to see the years now argument about the meaning of Black Lives Matter, those three words, and what they're saying about whether other lives matter through this lens. In claiming Black Lives Matter, Black activists are, of course, not saying that other lives don't matter. Instead, they are saying, can we look and focus on the systematic depredations Black lives are made to suffer? Can we acknowledge that there are reasons to begin here with our attention, that this is a specific set of historical circumstances that we need to attend to? In this, the terrain that Black Lives Matter lives on is not the white soul, but the lived experience of Black lives. And when I'm feeling hopeful during this long and hot summer of protest and infection, when I'm feeling hopeful, I see the longest and largest sustained multiracial protests for justice in this nation's history. I feel that Black Lives Matter has gained traction with white people precisely because white people are beginning to understand the concrete ways Black lives have failed to matter in white society. In this mode, Black Lives Matter begins for whites not with an active confession, but with the need, as anybody who participated in this summer's protest knows, to, quote, say their names in order to illuminate Black humanity and society's inability to see it. So here's my wish, here's my provocation. Instead of Amy Cooper pronouncing herself not racist, I wish she'd been able to say, yup, calling the police on Christian Cooper was indeed a racist thing to do, but sounding the depths of my own soul to determine whether I am a racist or not is crucially less important than acknowledging the harm I did Mr. Cooper. In other words, when Amy Cooper says, I am not racist, it allows her then to say the next sentence, I did not mean him harm. I wish that Amy Cooper cried tears, but not the white tears of acknowledging her racism, but instead the tears that came from realizing the harm she did to Mr. Cooper. Her tears should be for Mr. Cooper and not for herself. I wish that Amy Cooper would understand that focusing on fixing the racism in her soul is a necessary but not nearly a sufficient response. Instead, she would begin, and people like her, people like me, perhaps, she would need to begin to understand the way structural forces she was willing to activate in calling the police pervasively dehumanize Black people. She would then resolve herself to do something about them by going out in the world to do things. Join community organizations, build neighborhood partnerships, vote, protest, demand changes in resource allocation for policing and schools and medical care in order to deal with racism's effects. Like D'Angelo, I too wish white people were less fragile, but not because I wish they could more readily admit racism's infection in their own soul, but because I wish they were more willing to fight for a vision of justice in social, cultural, and material terms. I wish they would do so not with the sole intent of pronouncing themselves either free of the virus of racism, as Miss Cooper did, or forever plagued by it, as D'Angelo seems inclined to do. Save some of the effort of introspection for creatively imagining actions to relieve African Americans from the legacy of arbitrary injustice. And then let's get to work. All right. Well, thank you for listening to these set of thoughts today. I welcome anyone coming, reaching out and talking with me and emailing me and discussing things further. And if there are any students out there who are going to see this, please come to my office, even during this time of COVID, or at least contact me, and we will begin to talk. All right, everybody, stay safe, be well. Bye-bye.